Hello world, I'm Chris Myceny, aka Mr. FLIXTER, and I'm here to talk motion pictures. Mr. FLIXTER! If it's your first time watching my channel, welcome. If you haven't seen my channel before, I've been doing retro reviews of the 4 Scream films in anticipation of the new film, Scream 5, because theaters just opened up in Ontario, so it's just a matter of time before I can see it, and I'm so excited, but cautiously optimistic too, because I've been let down before, and that's not a knock at Scream 3. Well, not really. But I recommend you watch the first 3 Scream videos before this one, because I referenced those throughout this review. But don't worry, I put links in the description below.
Do you like scary movies?
If you haven't seen my channel yet, I'm a film critic for HorrorBuzz.com. And I make frequent appearances on their YouTube channel, HorrorBuzz Live, on Tuesdays at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. So I'll leave links in the description down below for those too. Please join us. Thanks. Now, I'm really excited for this episode, but before I get to that, if you've watched this channel before, or if you're a subscriber, then thank you very much. I appreciate your support. So far it's been going very well. And if you like what you see, make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Just like the first 3 videos, this is going to be a spoiler review.
You wish it was spoiler free.
In this week's episode, we finally made it. Today, I'm going to review Scream 4. You mean Scream? I admit, when I first heard this was coming out, I was really skeptical. It had been a while since the last Scream film came out. 11 years to be exact. Then I heard things like Wes Craven was involved again, and Kevin Williamson was returning. So I was really excited when it came out in theaters, and I really loved it when it came out. I'll explain why I like this film so much. It starts off with 2 girls, and they're discussing their difference in opinion when it comes to the artistic merits of torture porn. One's for it, and one is against it. Then they talk about the different reasons why they like it and why they don't like it. But before long, they both get stabbed to death by 2 different Ghostface killers who use phone calls and social media to attack their victims. Then, Rachel and Chloe pause what was the intro to Stab 6. Both discuss the artistic merits of slashers. Again, Rachel's against it, and Chloe's for it. But it's really funny because Chloe makes a reference. She says that serial killers are more scary because they're more realistic than, say, like zombies or aliens or little Asian ghost girls. So the 2 of them are talking, and then all of a sudden, Chloe starts stabbing Rachel in the gut so that she can finish her movie in peace. And that's when it cuts to Jenny, played by Amy Teagarden, and Marnie, played by Britt Robertson. They paused the beginning of Stab 7 so that they could talk about the artistic merits of the Stab films in particular. I love how the Stab films kept cranking out sequels over the years, so it's on part 7 now, because that's a huge comment on sequel oversaturation within the horror genre. So that's pretty good writing for Kevin Williamson. And then I love how they give multiple unique perspectives in a clear, concise way before faking you out. Not once, but twice. I just love the way Wes Craven directs this scene, because the way he builds up so much suspense in such a short amount of time. So there's 3 different sequences, but 6 different characters and 6 different opinions. It's just boom, boom. It's focused, it's clear, it's to the point. I love how immediately they start discussing the evolution of the horror genre over the years from different unique viewpoints that discuss both sides. So then we're introduced to Jenny and Marnie. And it's not before long before Jenny makes a prank phone call to Marnie using the Ghostface voice. See, because now in Woodsboro, everyone's using this Ghostface app on their phone. No matter what you sound like, it makes you sound like the Ghostface killer. So that means all the kids are now prank calling each other. So they've become really desensitized to getting Ghostface phone calls. So Jenny tries to scare Marnie. But then, very quickly, the tables turn, and all of a sudden, she's the one who's scared. Because she gets a call from, you guessed it, the real Ghostface. Played by Roger Jackson again. So far, he's played them in all 4 Scream films, and I love that. It's so nice to have him back. It wouldn't feel like a Scream film if he wasn't in it. Because, let's face it, after the first one, he is the voice of the Ghostface killer. And I love how this scene has a lot of callbacks to first part 1, because the way that Marnie gets thrown through the window is very similar to the way that Casey's boyfriend gets thrown through the window. When Jenny goes into the garage, there's another callback, and that's in reference to the end of part 1 for Tatum's death. Except this time it's in reverse. Instead of the garage door going up, it closes down on her. But then we get the title card, and that's how we know we're back in another Scream film, baby. Now, I love how Kevin Williamson wrote Ghostface this time, because this has to be the most sick, sadistic, sardonic so far, because some of the stuff that he says and some of the threats that he does are some of the most vividly brutal things that he says he wants to do to you. I couldn't believe it. And there's a lot more phone calls in this one too, which is nice. I think we could all agree that's what most of us come back for. Neve Campbell is back as Sydney Prescott. And I'm really glad she keeps recurring the role too. It really helps with the continuity. She's an author now, and she's written a self-help book called Out of Darkness. And she's in town because it's the 15th anniversary of the Woodsboro murders. Sydney appears to be single because she doesn't mention a boyfriend or a husband, and she appears to be really reserved too. She seems to have a lot of trust issues. I'm really glad that it turned out that she didn't wind up with Detective Kincaid from part 3. Because I mentioned the same thing in the last video. How I didn't think the two were very compatible and they didn't have very much chemistry. So I'm kind of glad that it worked out that they're not together. So I thought that was a pretty good writing choice. New to the cast is Alison Brie as Rebecca Walters. She's Sydney's publicist, and she has a real nasty cutthroat attitude, which kind of makes her the new Gail. However, she doesn't get a whole lot of character development or much screen time because she's killed off pretty early on. And I find that parking garage scene pretty problematic. Like, how exactly does Ghostface both lock the door on one side, but then he loosens the handle on the other side? Wouldn't she still be able to get out? When a movie's as good as this, things can get overlooked. David Arquette is back as Dewey Riley. He's married to Gail Weathers, who's played by Courtney Cox, and they say that they've been together ever since part 3. So it's nice how they pick up as if their lives have carried on ever since 2000. Dewey has been promoted to the sheriff. So Gail has this horrible case of writer's block. So when she finds out Dewey's leading the investigation for what's going on for this remake of sorts of the Woodsboro murders, or is it? She wants to get involved in the investigation too. But Dewey shuts her down, which causes a marital strife, which is pretty funny, because there's also a new deputy in town, Deputy Judy Hicks, played by Marley Shelton, and they have this really funny rivalry for both Dewey's affection and his attention. Deputy Judy makes these lemon squares, but whenever she tries to give them to Dewey, she lays down some pretty thick euphemisms. But Gail jumps in and she shuts that down right away. Hayden Panettiere joins the cast as Kirby Reed. She's by far my favorite character in this film because she's both a horror fanatic And she also has a really good sense of humor. And the Kirby character is really interesting because instead of being a new version of one specific character, she seems to be an amalgamation of many different characters. She has some of the most memorable lines throughout the whole thing. So as Kirby's driving to school, she stops and picks up her friend Jill Roberts, played by Emma Roberts. So as Kirby picks up Jill, she's really apologetic. And she actually says a really funny line that's foreshadowing for later that I didn't notice the first few times I watched it, but I did when I rewatched it for this review. When she opens the car door, the first thing that Kirby says to Jill is, "Please don't kill me." Get it? She's all apologetic because Jill's ex-boyfriend Trevor called Kirby last night because Jill won't talk to him, and they pick up their friend Olivia Morris. Trevor's played by Nico Tortorella. Olivia is played by Marielle Jaffe. So when she gets picked up, she also mentions Trevor called her last night too. They'll start talking about the Angel of Death, aka Sidney Prescott, who we find out through conversation is actually Jill's cousin. I really like this scene because it does a good job of doing a little bit of world building, but not too much so it feels like an overabundance of exposition. Instead, it's just people having a casual conversation, talking about their everyday lives, and as they're driving on their way to school, we learn little tidbits here and there about their past. Rory Culkin joins the cast as Charlie Walker. So does Eric Knudsen as Robbie Mercer. When the girls arrive at, obviously, Woodsboro High, the two guys greet them and ask them that all-important question.
Do you like scary movies?
But they just tell the guys to get the cameras out of their face because Robbie, he wears this weird headset and apparently he's live streaming all the time. So I'm not exactly sure how he's doing that, but that's a minor discrepancy. They are ecstatic because all the commotion, because their favorite stab movies are actually coming to life. The girls, however, are less enthusiastic. And eventually Charlie and Robbie, they start working with Gail on her investigation, because after it doesn't go so well with Dewey, she goes rogue. And then I really like the interactions and the chemistry between Gail and the two high school students, Charlie and Robbie. They have some pretty good scenes together. Because part of their agreement to help out with the investigation is to have Sydney show up at their cinema club. So when they're in the cinema club, that's when they finally explain to Gail and Sydney the different rules of the remake. I really like this scene because it further cements Robbie and Charlie as the new Randy. Anthony Anderson and Adrian Brody play two cops that are assigned to protect Jill and Sydney, and Kate, played by Mary McDonnell. And she's Jill's mom, which makes her Sydney's aunt. And that's when there's this nice little callback to part one, when Trevor sneaks through the window to talk to Jill, because eventually Sydney walks in on them, and even she says that the two of them remind her of the past. Because Billy used to sneak in the window to talk to Sydney. Fun fact, Anthony Anderson's death scene later on was actually based off real events. So this brings us to my favorite scene in the film. Jill and Kirby are at Jill's house, and they're in her room, and they're watching a movie together. And then Jill picks up her phone, and she calls Olivia, who lives across the street. And she tries to do a really bad Ghostface impersonation, which is also a really good foreshadowing. But then Kirby receives a call on her phone, and when she picks up, she just kind of writes it off. She thinks it's actually Trevor. So she buys into the whole thing, and she starts going along with what he's saying. And it's really intense, because after he correctly guesses the movie that they're watching, that's when she starts to take things a little more seriously. And that's when he says that he's actually standing in the closet. She doesn't believe this at all. He calls his bluff, and she opens the door. She calls him a liar, doesn't want to hear anymore. But Ghostface declares,
I never said I was in your closet.
and then suddenly Ghostface kicks the door down, starts stabbing Olivia, throws her around the room. He even tosses her out the window just to send a little message to Jill and Kirby watching helplessly across the street. And Sydney finds Olivia's mutilated corpse. And it's all gutted just like Casey was from part 1. Except the gore in this is taken to a whole nother level. I love the gore in this movie. They weren't afraid to really go there with this one. I gotta say, these two Ghostface killers have got to be the most brutal so far. Also, the Stabathon scene, about halfway through, is another fun highlight. This is because it both replicates the opening scene from part 2 at the movie theater and the party scene at the end of part 1 simultaneously. There's even this really clever scene when Gail is holding a webcam in her hand, but this time Dewey is in the van and he's shouting at her to look behind her because Ghostface is sneaking up on her. Because in part 1 it was Sydney and Kenny who were shouting at Randy to turn around. The only thing I really found problematic with this scene is Gail gets stabbed, but they didn't have the guts to kill her off. That would have been something that really brought both Sydney and Dewey together, in my opinion. Because it goes against the rules, like I've mentioned in the previous 3 videos, that no one is safe. So when you take that aspect away, it kind of takes away from the emotional impact of what happened to those characters. Because it gets to a point where no matter what happens, you're like, oh, doesn't matter. They're going to survive. I just hope in part 5 they do have the guts to finally kill off one of these legacy characters. This brings us to the grand finale. It's reminiscent of the opening scene from part 1. Except this time, Kirby gets her second phone call. And it's Charlie in the chair. This is when Kirby really solidifies herself as one of the greatest Scream characters ever written, except for Randy. Not only does she match wits with Ghostface, but she just nails every single question. But for some reason, she doesn't let him finish his last question before she trails off on like 20 different remake titles, which I gotta say, I thought was really impressive the first time, because she just keeps listing it and listing and listing and listing. It's so entertaining. When she finally does get stabbed by Charlie, it was so crushing. It's one of those characters, just like Tatum, like I mentioned in my video for the first one. One of those characters where you're like, oh, not Kirby. So I really hope that, even though despite what I said before, this is the character that I do hope comes back, because she has a lot of potential to carry these films on. She's one of the strongest characters in this movie, so it'd be kind of a shame and kind of a waste of a character if she wasn't brought forward into future films. So I'm really hoping she's in part 5. This is where Roger Jackson really shines, because he really gets into her head, because she's really afraid for Charlie's life at this point. This is some of the best voice acting that he's done so far. I really like after the unmasking, when Jill looks Sydney dead in the eyes, and she references part 1 when she says, "Surprised, Sydney?" And I really like their plan too, because Jill, who I noticed is now dressed like Billy Loomis from part 1, explains her plan about how she's going to set up her ex-boyfriend Trevor, who I also noticed is dressed up as Sydney's dad from part 1, while she, the new Sydney, and Charlie, the new Randy, make him take the fall and they survive, unbeknownst to the media. And I really like the idea of them being the opposite of part 3, because if you think about it, instead of doing a big budget Hollywood production, they're doing their own homemade snuff films, and they're going to upload it to the internet, thus immortalizing what they did and making their own movie. And I really like the social commentary about having fans and followers and becoming famous on the internet, because if you think about it, this was pretty ahead of its time. This was kind of before YouTube got big like that, and it was a legit source of income for people, and I really wasn't expecting it. This is the first time that I didn't see it coming for who the killers were. I also like the aspect of how Sydney never really asked for any of this to happen to her. Jill, on the other hand, actively pursues it. And I love the scene when she inflicts harm on herself to make it look like she was attacked. It's just so brutal, you just can't look away. But she never goes off the rails to the point where it feels like it's overacting at all. Just totally crazy, willing to do whatever it takes for the cause. Overall, I think it does a really good job at encapsulating 2011, and for that matter, that decade between 2000 and 2010, because there was a lot of things going on in horror at the time. And this does good at commenting on that. It has a lot of satirical looks at it, and it does a lot of good self-referential looks too. And Kevin Williamson does a really good job at the whodunit aspect this time, because the finger pointing essentially divides and conquers the group. I also like how they included new technology. Plus, I appreciate the social commentary about the dangers about being trending online and really searching for followers. It's also got that underlying theme of what is the cost of fame. I love how it doesn't just copy the original trilogy, it takes what makes them great and then applies them in new ways. And another thing, I love how them making their own homemade snuff films subtly brings the found footage subgenre into play. Ultimately, the theme is nothing beats the original, which Sydney states clearly to Jill right before she kills her. In my opinion, the whole point of the movie is that the biggest mistake of most remakes is they don't actually honor the original film. Therefore, they don't really add anything new or fresh or original to the horror genre. The biggest twist of all is this isn't a remake at all. It's a sequel in remake's clothing. And because of my explanation, it surpasses meta and becomes outright paradoxical. So, I posted a review on Facebook, and my grade is an A-. This concludes my review of Scream 4. You mean Screform? Again, I highly recommend this underrated sequel, and I think it's worth a revisit. Please keep in mind, this is only my opinion. It's okay to disagree with me, and it's okay to agree to disagree. Just have some class about it. Check me out on the Horror Buzz Live channel. I left a link in the description below. I also write my reviews and put them on Facebook. I'll put that description down there too. You have to join the group to read the review, but go ahead and do that. Why not if you love reading movie reviews? I have plenty there. And don't forget to check out my reviews on horrorbuzz.com for all things horror. I'll leave links in the description below. If you're interested, please read them. I'm Chris Mitany. You can call me Mr. FLIXTER. And I just love talking motion pictures. Until next time, have a great day. Mr. FLIXTER. And remember, if you're a cinemaniac like me, make sure you like and subscribe down below.